Stay tuned, metal fans, because I'll be counting down my 10 favorite metal albums of 2022. Plus, I'll be throwing in my honorable mentions, as well as albums that others are praising this year, but just didn't make it to my list. So all of that coming up. So another good year for vinyl releases, and as I did last year, I totaled up all of the vinyl I bought in 2022, and this time that number comes to 246 albums. And out of all of those, we're going to discuss at least 10 of them, if not a few more that fall outside of the list. What that means, of course, is that if I didn't buy the album on the vinyl format, then it's not going to be in my top 10. Speaking of the list, I wanted to mention a few things regarding it. Always important to get this stuff out of the way right away. First and foremost, no EPs, no compilations, no reissues, and no live albums. My list will be for new studio full-length albums only. Of course, as I do every year, I want to stress the total and utter subjectivity of my list. This is my list and not necessarily yours. In fact, you should come up with your own list. Maybe do a video on YouTube or post your list to social media. I mean, why not? And in case it matters, I didn't watch any other top 10 metal album videos here on YouTube before shooting this. Whatever other people choose is wholly irrelevant to my own selection process, so keep that in mind when you hit the comments section. Also, I wanted to briefly run through my honorable mentions, basically albums that just barely slipped off the main list but are also well worth checking out. So let's get to that first. Starting off with Saxon, this is their 23rd studio album. It is entitled Carpe Diem. Definitely legends of the new wave of British heavy metal era, so very trad metal here, obviously. Favorites are Age of Steam, Supernova, and Living on the Limit. Of course, I also have to mention Evil Invaders and their third studio album, Shattering Reflection. Belgian band that mixes speed, thrash, and trad metal. Favorites here are Hissing and Crescendo, In Deepest Black, and Eternal Darkness. Also in 22, we got the 12th studio album from Belphegor. This is The Devils. Definitely some truly evil blackened death metal from Austria. Favorites on this one are Totentanz Danse Macabre, Glorious Physierung del Teufels, and Ritus Incendium Diabolis. Next is Municipal Waste with their 7th studio album, Electrified Brain. Solid dose of American crossover thrash metal. Favorites on this one are Demoralizer, High Speed Steel, Crank the Heat, and Barreled Rage. Also, you should check out the first full-length studio album from Schizophrenia entitled Recollections of the Insane. Great death thrash from Belgium. Favorites here are Divine Immolation, Sea of Sorrow, and Souls of Retribution. Next is Watain with their 7th studio album, The Agony and Ecstasy of Watain. Some Swedish black metal here. Favorites are The Howling and We Remain. And of course, you should check out the 8th studio album from Revocation entitled Nether Heaven. They are American tech death thrash. Favorites here are Nihilistic Violence, Strange and Eternal, and God Forsaken. I should also say that this album just barely got bumped out of my top 10, so you could consider this number 11 were I to extend the list. At any rate, this is the honorable mention album that I would absolutely recommend the most. So with that, let's get to my top 10 metal albums of 2022. My number 10 choice is from a French band that might be better heard than described, but let's at least attempt a brief explanation of the 14th studio album from Blut Nord called Disharmonium Undreamable Abysses. Blut Nord blends black metal, dark ambient, industrial, and avant-garde musical elements to create atmospheric sonic landscapes. On this record, you'll also get some strong literary influence from H.P. Lovecraft, though the otherworldly sounds from the tracks likewise secure that impression. I'd imagine this would probably be a great album to hear with headphones, preferably in the dark, where you can let your imagination go into all sorts of directions. Favorites are Chants of the Deep Ones, Tales of the Old Dreamer, and Keziah Mason. So not your usual black metal band by any stretch of the imagination. Tons of dark, atmospheric moments with a murkiness and dissonance that is, shall we say, all their own. Much of which is why this made it to my top 10 and not in my honorable mentions. So at number 10 is Disharmonium Undreamable Abysses by Blut Nord. At number 9 is an album from a Polish death metal band that started out much more in a black metal space. Over time, though, they evolved, as many bands do, with their 3 most recent albums being the most removed from their early works. Well, 2022 gave us one of those 3, and it's the 12th studio album from Behemoth, known as Opus Contra Naturam. So here we've got some dark atmosphere and crushing extreme metal, often moving from one to the other and back again. Still some layers of black metal throughout, still that standard grandiosity and aggression as well, and the lyrics are the usual dark and evil stuff you've come to expect from them. Favorites here are The Deathless Sun, Neo-Spartacus, and Thy Becoming Eternal. And I still hold that this would be a really decent gateway album for those wanting to dabble into black metal, or in this case, blackened death metal. Check out their music videos from this album as well to get the full effect, the full dramatic effect, that is. Good stuff. So at number 9 is Opus Contra Naturam by Behemoth. My number 8 choice is from a legendary German thrash band that lost a key member in 2021, but still managed to put out one of the best albums of their post-reunion era. Yes, I'm talking about the 15th studio album from Destruction. This is Diabolical. So, Mike is out of the band but was replaced by Martin Furia, who fits in well with the Destruction sound. Leads from Demir are still as strong as ever. Also, plenty of pummeling drums and blistering riffs throughout. And of course, we all love that classic schmear vocal delivery. Still vicious after all these years. Favorites are No Faith in Humanity, Tormented Soul, and The Lonely Wolf. I think the best thing about the album and modern output from the band in general is that it truly does stick to its guns. It doesn't chase after what's new or hip or acceptable. I mean, if you want destruction, you get destruction. And 40 years of it, to me, shows a pretty good track record. Though to be fair, that same consistency does factor into why this album is lower on my list. Still, it's kick-ass enough to be in the top 10 and well worth every spin. So at number 8 is Diabolical by Destruction. So my number 7 choice comes from a band that holds the distinction of being part of the infamous Big Four thrash here in the United States. And like a couple of those other bands, they too had their missteps in the 1990s and the 2000s, but modern albums have brought back some of that lost punch and heaviness, and their latest record is certainly no exception. As you can guess, I'm referring to the 16th studio album from American thrash veterans Megadeth. This is The Sick, The Dying, and The Dead. So despite some gripes I have in terms of spoken word bits and similar dramatic intros, as well as some moments of cringy lyrics and a couple less than strong tracks, there really is a lot to like about this record. It did take me some time to warm up to, but when I did, I got some amazing lead work, decent riffs, and a good overall flow of tracks. Favorites here are Night Stalkers, Killing Time, Soldier On, and We'll Be Back. So, a noticeable step up from their previous album, which I also liked. If you dismiss this album right off the bat, I suggest giving it a few more chances because there is an album worth hearing in this one. I will admit that I initially had this one a little higher on my list, but I had to be honest with myself in that the next album I'll be discussing got a few more spins with me throughout the year, so the 2 albums did a bit of a switcheroo. Anyways, at number 7 is The Sick, The Dying, and The Dead by Megadeth. At number 6 is an album from a largely Swedish melodic death metal band that has gone through a few vocalists, as well as developed their overall sound from their strictly death metal days of old. Many fans are still on board with them, though the purists might have abandoned ship. But since they're on my list, you can assume that I like them. And that's why we're going to chat about the 11th studio album for Arch Enemy. This is Deceivers. So, quite a bit of the melodic here, though also thrashy riffs, some unmistakable power metal elements, and of course the vocals of one Elisa White-Gluz, who moves deftly between death growls and ridiculously strong and powerful clean vocals. Also, the drums in this record are utterly thunderous and work very well in the mix. Favorites are In the Eye of the Storm, Sunset Over the Empire, and House of Mirrors. I do feel like Arch Enemy is in a similar camp to other older heavy metal bands who chose to bring in some strains of power metal. And while Arch Enemy doesn't sound like a band such as, say, Kreator, the power metal utilization has some parallels. In fact, it might not be inaccurate to call this aggressive power metal with some death metal influences, rather than the other way around at times. Come to think of it, I'd rather my power metal sound like this. So at number 6 is Deceivers by Arch Enemy. At number 5 is an album from an American progressive metal band that had its glory days in the 80s and the early 90s, and like many of their contemporaries, struggled to remain relevant for the next couple of decades. However, the last 4 albums, along with a change in vocalists, brought the band back into a respectable place. And with their 16th studio album, that doesn't seem to be changing anytime soon. Naturally, I am talking about Queensrÿche, and the album is Digital Noise Alliance. So with this record, the needle dips more into the progressive with its ponderous mid-paced tracks, some callbacks to classic Queensrÿche, but also plenty of differentiation from vocalist Todd La Torre as his voice evolves over time. Favorites include Sick Death, Behind the Walls, and Out of the Black. A definite step up from the already solid album before it with well-crafted songs. It's an album whose trajectory is still pointed upward, and that's why it's on this list. Of course, I knew this would be in my top 10 from the first time I'd heard it, and figured it would rank fairly high. And now, here it is. So at number 5 is Digital Noise Alliance by Queensrÿche. My number 4 choice is from a death metal supergroup of sorts, as you'd certainly recognize former or current members of Leak, Catatonia, Opeth, and of course Paradise Lost here. And in this case, it's a winning combination to give us their amazing 6th studio album. They are, of course, Bloodbath, and this is Survival of the Sickest. So here we've got Nick Holmes' signature gruff vocals alongside rapid tempo shifts and equally insane riffs throughout. Also some moody solos reminiscent at times of early Paradise Lost. The music might be more in line with bands like Morbid Angel, Death, and maybe a little bit of Grave. Also some guest vocal appearances from Barney of Napalm Death, Luke from Gorguts, and Mark from Insidious Disease. I gotta say, the music video for Zombie Inferno is killer. It should be watched as soon as possible, especially if you're a fan of 70s Italian horror movies, like me. Favorites on this record are Zombie Inferno, Carved, and Affliction of Extinction. So, deeply satisfying old-school death metal in both the US and Swedish veins, slathered with brutal vocals hinting at early Paradise Lost. Basically, it checks off so many of the boxes for me and what I love about death metal. So at number 4 is Survival of the Sickest by Bloodbath. At number 3 is an album from another German thrash institution that has certainly experimented with their sound throughout the decades, but I really like what they've landed in modern times. I mentioned them briefly before, but we're going to talk a little bit more about them now, notably their 15th studio album. This is Kreator with Hate, Über Alles. So another album for me that got better with repeated spins, in part because I've generally been on board with their modern flirtation with power and trad metal elements in their thrash. No problems there. And despite a couple tracks that didn't hold up as well for me, the rest of the album is full of great leads and some real track variety, bringing in tribal drums, female vocals, choral chanting, a pinch of neo-folk, and for the most part, some truly banger riffs. Favorites are Hate Über Alles, Killer of Jesus, Demonic Future, and Dying Planet. I think if I had just listened to this album once or twice, it might have ranked considerably lower in my top 10, but I'm glad I spent some more time with it, which is why it's now as high as it is. So at number 3 is Hate Über Alles by Kreator. My number 2 choice is from a band that started out as a chaotic hybrid of thrash metal, punk, and experimental elements, but morphed into a fairly unique and very heavy progressive metal band. Although they lost a key songwriter guitarist in 2005, they forged on and created some truly unpredictable music, steeped in angular riffs and science fiction concepts. Of course, I'm talking about the 15th studio album from Canada's own Voivod. This is Synchro Anarchy. So as you would expect, we still get plenty of off-kilter riffs, lots of sci-fi, and some moments of thrash, though not of the frequency of their 80s thrash output by any stretch. Great production on this one as well. Favorites on this album are Paranormalium, Sleeves Off, Quest for Nothing, and Memory Failure. And to be honest, there's often been a bit of a genius factor to this band's sound that I didn't always appreciate. And although they did have some less than impressive material in their mid-career, this latest album really has me won over and even brought me back into the fold. In fact, this album almost made it to my number 1 slot, but there was another album that came out 4 months later that had a bit more impact on me, which we'll be discussing in mere seconds. So at number 2 is Synchro Anarchy by Voivod. And my number one album of 2022 is from an American death doom band that has noticeably evolved since their debut record back in 2014, adding additional musical textures while still maintaining their crushing sound. And while some listeners don't like the change, or perhaps change of any sort, I'm thoroughly welcoming of these elements. And that's why we're going to discuss the fourth studio album from Temple of Void, entitled Summoning the Slayer. So this might be Temple of Void's most accessible album to date, but that doesn't mean they left out the crushing death doom one bit. It's certainly melancholic and catchy, though we also have some groove moments here and there. We also have a rather odd song at the end, such being Disillusion, with its proggy acoustic work melding with some rather trippy Sabbath-type vibes. Truthfully, I love the unexpectedness and overall bizarre album closer, so no problem there. Favorites are Death Touch, Hex Curse and Conjuration, and the Transcending Horror. This is one of those instances where I actually enjoy the way a band has branched out, but without losing its musical impact. It's melodic, it's unpredictable, and it's still crushing death doom. And yes, this might seem like an odd choice for number one, but I can't ignore just how many times I've played this record in 2022. The answer is a lot. I even bought the damn t-shirt for the album. So the top metal album of 2022, for me, is Summoning the Slayer by Temple of Void. Of course, there were also albums released in 2022 that others might put on their own lists, but simply didn't make mine. So to be fair, let's just mention some of them here, and briefly. First is the seventh studio album from Swedish black metal band Dark Funeral. This is We Are the Apocalypse. It did have some moments for me, but ultimately I didn't pick this one. But I do know a lot of people spoke well of this record in 2022, so that's why I'm mentioning it here. Next is the 11th studio album from American death metal band Immolation. This is Acts of God. Honestly, just didn't get around to it, but I do like early Immolation, so I might check this one out. Who knows? Maybe I really missed out on a good album this year. We'll see. I should also mention the 12th studio album from Swedish melodic death metal band Amon Amarth. This is The Great Heathen Army. Now, I did like the previous record, but the singles from this one just didn't grab me at all. Maybe later I'll stream the rest of the album and give it more of a chance. Who knows? We'll see. Also of relevance to 2022 is the 8th studio album from American death metal band Autopsy. This is Morbidity Triumphant. Decent record, but hadn't spent much time with it in lieu of the zillion other albums that came my way, so that's the story there. Of course, some folks will be talking about the second studio album from American death metal band Undeath. This is It's Time to Rise from the Grave. I did get to hear some of this and generally liked it, but I didn't get around to further spins, so maybe I'll do that in future months. From what I did hear, though, it sounded pretty good. So I do go into much more depth on my top 10 choices in various episodes of Vinyl Haul, which is why I didn't do so here. I've linked those specific episodes in the description of this video, so you should probably check those out if you want more on the albums. In fact, I recommend you actually do that. Otherwise, what did you think about my choices? Maybe you have some of your own. I would love to see a top 10 list from you, as well as anything else relevant, in the comments below. Of course, I'm looking forward to seeing all of your top metal albums of 2022 videos here on YouTube, for those who've made them, of course. If you have one, definitely mention that in the comments so I can check it out. As I do each year, I did hold off on seeing anyone's top 10 video until I made my own first. The thing is, I'm big on making this list totally my own and not jumping on what's merely popular or necessarily expected. I mean, I actually do listen to all of these albums quite a bit. So, there you go. And if you're new to this channel, just so you know, my name is Matt. This is the Accusation Network, where each and every week I cover the subject of metal vinyl collecting, but I also chat about classic and modern metal in general. If that sounds like something you want to see more of, then definitely consider subscribing to this channel if you haven't already done so, obviously. Also like the video and maybe even share it with some of your friends. As for my regular viewers, a big, giant thank you to all of you who took the time to watch my videos, comment on them, and share them on social media. Definitely looking forward to making more videos for you in 2023. So until then, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.